For more on this, we're joined by Farah Pandith, who was the first ever State Department Special Representative to Muslim communities. She's now on the Council on Foreign Relations. David Ignatius, our friend and columnist for the Washington Post, and CBS News Justice and Homeland Security correspondent Bob Orr also with us. Farah, this was a very disturbing report to me that we just heard from Clarissa. She's quoting one person saying, well, it's not necessarily about religion. But how do we come to grips with this, and what can we do to turn this situation around?
So sure, I mean, this is an issue of our time. This is the issue of our time. And when you think about the pool from which the bad guys are recruiting, you look at the numbers. 1/4 of the planet is Muslim, 1.6 billion people. 62% of that number is under the age of 30. That's the pool from which they recruit. I'd make 2 points about this issue of recruiting. The terrible tragedy in Paris this last week turned the world's attention back on how are people getting recruited? How are the bad guys building their armies? And in fact, this is the war of ideas, and that's where we have to be looking. So there are 2 points here. One is that the vast majority of people who get recruited, it is a solvable problem. We can stop the recruitment from happening with a vast majority of people. And the other is the solutions are affordable and they are available.
Bob Orr, we're talking about surveilling these people. We heard that the Algerians apparently tipped the French police off that this attack was coming, but they seem to be saying, you know, we just didn't have the resources to track all of these people. What's the situation here in this country? Or should we expect an attack?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's very possible, Bob, we could see something like this. There are a number of people in this country, and I don't have the exact number, who are like-minded, radicals, who are being influenced by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and associated groups, being called in this clarion call to come join us. We're the hot group now. If you want some adventure in your life, come to Syria and fight with ISIS. That's a message, as crazy as it sounds, it resonates with certain people, some who are disenfranchised, some who are just kind of casting about, looking for their lot in life. The FBI is doing a pretty good job, you heard Eric Holder say, of monitoring the threats we know about. It's the unknowns that concern us, and I think it's the kind of problem where you'll never have enough resources to address all of those potentials.
There is still a war on terror. That seems to be the message here this morning. Where are we in this, David?
I talked, Bob, over the weekend to officials from different parts of the U.S. government to ask precisely that question, and here's what I learned. First, people have recognized that the U.S. has limited credibility in telling the Muslim world what a good Muslim is. That's really not something the United States can do effectively. It has to work with others who do have credibility, you know, Muslim religious leaders, leaders of governments in the region, a range of public and private groups. Secondly, the things that work in countering this fire that's raging on the internet tend to come up from the bottom. They're things that police, local law enforcement is picking up around the United States. Attorney General Holder said to you that the White House is sponsoring a conference in February to talk about countering violent extremism. That's going to be an important conference, and one of the things I know they're going to do there is take the example of Boston, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, 3 cities where there have been very effective grassroots programs to deal with this. So we'll have to focus on what those are. And then the third thing that people talk about is creating a network of networks. You have all these networks. Farah Pandith knows better than anybody in the U.S. how this kind of thing works, but gather them together. Don't try to coordinate it from the top. You know, it's in that sense not a war with a general. It's a network of networks dispersed that can deal with this social media phenomenon that we're seeing, that we've never seen anything quite like it before.
So how do we get to these people?
So one of the good
through
things,
to them.
Right, we know how kids get recruited. We understand that. In the 13 years since 9/11, we have perfected the art of understanding how that happens. What we haven't done is to be able to mobilize out of government efforts, whether it is hip hop artists or graffiti artists or social entrepreneurs or activists. We have to get them out so that they're blasting the marketplace with alternative narratives to the narrative of extremists. Now, in both the Bush and Obama administration, we have built some of those kinds of networks. But as David said, Government can be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we hear on the ground. In order for us to defeat this, we have to make sure that those outside of government get the kind of resources they need to take the ideas from the grassroots, from Argentina to Zanzibar, and push them forward. And what policymakers have a really hard time doing is being comfortable with this idea of a crisis of identity that youth are having around the world, that a phenomenon of these young Muslims that have grown up in a post-9/11 world, who are navigating waters that we as government folks, let's say, can't feel so comfortable about, but in fact, listening at the very local level to what communities are saying about what will help prevent them from sliding into a place where they are seduced by the extremists is exactly where we need to be. You look at some of the businesses in this world, innovators who have helped put money into these kinds of global networks. You look at the seed programs that the US government has put on the ground through our embassies, and if we scale them up, if we move them forward, you will have an all-day, everyday drumbeat that can begin to compete with the bad guys who have resources, who have tactics, who have sophistication and savvy.
You know, Mike Morrell was saying earlier, this is a reminder that Al-Qaeda is still out there. It's not just ISIS anymore, that they're still there, Bob.
No, that's exactly right. All three of these guys in the attacks in Paris were connected to a degree to different terrorist groups. The Kouachi brothers had some tentacles down to Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Koulibaly, the guy that took hostages at the grocery, he self-identified with ISIS. We don't know if ISIS knew about him or not. But these groups will leverage the success of these attacks. They'll use it in their propaganda campaign. One of the things that we can do to help counter this, I think, is to tell people what an empty future this jihad can be. There's an example of a guy from Alabama, Omar Hamami. This is a kid who became radicalized. He went to Somalia to join al-Shabaab. He put out videos. He was a rap artist. He was a high-profile guy. In the end, he ran afoul of the leadership. They put out a contract on this kid. He was hunted down and killed. That's not a successful ending. That's the kind of story we can use as a lesson.
Farah, what does the Muslim community in general, how does this affect them? What do they think about it?
So you've seen all kinds of voices since September 11th talk about this issue, but it's on a very micro level, and there are two pieces of this. One is what governments need to hear around the world. They want to hear the clerics and the university leaders and the so-called right Muslims speak up. And that's important and it's symbolic, and they certainly did that here in the Paris attacks. But what you don't hear are those that are the nuanced voices, the hip-hop artists, the people that we don't generally look at and say they count. But actually they do count. Do you know any 16-year-old kid who's listening to their parents about what should happen? No, they're listening to their peers, and it's the peers that matter. And what we have to do is talent scout around the world and lift up the voices that are actually making a difference for these kids. You know, the communicators are putting the message out, but it's the audience that's absorbing the narrative of the extremists that have to be cut off, and we have to be more creative about how we do it. A network that we know about, that you talked about in terms of the formers, the Against Violent Extremism Network, which is a really powerful network of former extremists of all kinds talking in a credible way about why they did what they did and how they came back. What would happen if you amplify them in a gigantic way?
David, do you think the government and the Congress will see this as a serious threat, or will Congress just fall back into this dysfunction that we've
it's clear,
become so accustomed to?
Listening to Congressman McCall, listening to Senator Cornyn, listening to any political voice, I think there's a recognition this is a big problem. I think as we look back 14 years to our experience after 9/11, we do need to think, how do we respond to it without overreacting, without doing things that make the problem worse? And I think the kinds of things that Farah is talking about that I mentioned earlier, where it's not the U.S. blaring that it's a war on terror, which is read in the Muslim world as a war on Muslims. It's subtler, and it's trying to work out through these soft power things that are pervasive, global. It's trying to do it in a smarter way this time around. So I hope that Congress, as it gets mobilized, doesn't make the problem worse by adding things that turn this into a megaphone as opposed to something more subtle.
All right. Well, thanks to all three of you this morning. Very enlightening. And we'll be back to talk about some of the other news of the week, and there actually was some in just a minute.